The cost of living has moved up dramatically over the past few years, probably 30 or 40%. And Americans, we're living paycheck to paycheck. And that's why you're seeing this surge in jobs, because so many people now have been forced to take second and third jobs. Moonlighting is at an all-time record high. That's also why you've seen credit card debt hitting record highs, even as credit card interest rates are at record highs, because Americans are borrowing and taking second and third jobs to pay their rent or to pay the utility bills or to put food on the table or pay for their insurance. The necessities of life have increased in price substantially, and it's going to continue. It's not going to stop. It's going to be relentless. The reason that everything costs so much more is because the government is so much larger than it used to be, and therefore it's so much more expensive because the public has to support the government. And if the government isn't going to raise taxes, then it simply prints money and raises prices. Inflation is a tax. It's the way the government takes your purchasing power and transfers it to itself, so it can give it to whoever is benefiting from the spending. And so it's really the tax burden that is skyrocketing, and especially since COVID, but even before COVID, the burden was going up, and now it's just really skyrocketed. And, as more and more people in my generation leave the workforce and start collecting Social Security and Medicare, the burden is just going to be greater and greater on everybody else. And yeah, civil unrest is coming. And, it could get even worse, because what I think is ultimately where we're headed is price controls. I think the government, they've already started blaming companies for the inflation. Companies are too greedy. They're jacking up their prices. It's not fair. They're taking advantage of people. This is all a bunch of BS. The companies have no choice. Inflation is forcing prices higher. They would rather not raise their prices. In fact, they've dragged their feet. They've absorbed a lot of the increased costs, hoping that it was transitory. But, they've had to raise their prices to maintain their margins, to stay in business. Because if they go out of business, then, there's nothing to buy because they're no longer selling. But I think the government is going to impose price controls as things really start to spiral. And then that takes a bad situation and makes it worse. So now it's not just that prices are higher. It's just you can't even buy the stuff because the goods are no longer available for sale because, of the price controls. Or you can buy the stuff, but it's even more expensive because you got to buy it on the black market. The only place you can get it is from a criminal who's willing to break the law. And then the price is even higher because the premium is greater because he's risking going to jail selling you this stuff. Now, there will be some stuff available if you want to wait on a long line. If you don't want to wait on a long line, you could pay somebody to wait on it for you. But then it really makes the cost of goods go up. So, there's no way that the government can stop it with these gimmicks, but they're under a lot of political pressure to do something, and they never want to accept responsibility for creating the inflation. They just want to look for scapegoats to blame it on. But that's going to create even more civil unrest. And in the culture that we have now, where everybody feels entitled to something, where people feel that they don't have to work, that they can sit home and get a welfare check or get food stamps, through SNAP or housing vouchers or healthcare or free education. Once Americans accept that, right? And we used to be a nation of rugged individuals. When welfare was first introduced during the Depression, a lot of people were too embarrassed to take it, and they had too much pride to take it. And there were actually people who paid the money back. Like when they got jobs, they felt like they needed to pay it back. Like, how I can't take something that I didn't earn, right? So Americans had a different culture and a different sense of responsibility and personal dignity. But now, when people just expect that they're owed something simply because they're there, and you believe in that, well, theft is simply a way of cutting out the middleman, right? If I think that I'm entitled to free stuff and the government can take it from other people and give it to me, well, if I'm not getting what I believe I'm entitled to, why wait for the government to steal it for me? I'll just do it myself. I'll just go help myself to whatever's there. And people will think that way. A lot of people will think, well, it's reparations. Why wait for the government? I'm just going to take what's mine. And so all this is coming. And so it's not going to be pretty. I think we're just getting started. I think there's still a lot of fear and doubt in the market. Just look at the underperformance of the gold and silver mining equities. Traders are very skeptical of this rally. They didn't expect it. In fact, just a couple of months ago, Newmont Mining and Barrick Gold were basically downgraded to sells, the equivalent, holds by Wall Street, because they saw no upside in the price of gold. And that's when gold was around 2,000. We're now around 2,400, 20% increase. That's pretty good upside. And, it's still early in the year. And, it's just that the traders still don't understand it. They think, well, the Fed is going to cut rates fewer times than we thought, or is going to delay the rate cuts. And they think that's bearish for gold. But it's really not bearish, because it doesn't even matter if the Fed cuts rates at all. The Fed should be hiking rates, and they're not. And that's what's bullish for gold, because inflation is already headed back up. It never got down to 2%. Now it's headed back higher. I think we're going to take out the 9.1% peak from mid-2022. I mean, all the forward-looking indicators, commodity prices, not just gold and silver, but all commodities, are showing incredible strength, much more so than we saw in the previous year. And credit growth has continued unabated despite the Fed's rate hikes. Government is borrowing more. Private sector is borrowing more. Everybody is spending. Deficits are out of control. There's no sign of any fiscal restraint. It's the deficit spending that is the driving force behind the inflation. And the Fed monetization and the artificially low interest rates. And even though the Fed has hiked rates many times and we're back above 5%, that's still a low rate. It's still a stimulative rate. It's not a restrictive rate, the way Powell and his cronies at the Fed claim. The Fed is still providing easy money to the economy. And of course, we have highly stimulative fiscal policy. So it's an inflationary cocktail, and gold understands this, or gold investors. And the big investors are the central banks. Foreign central banks, particularly emerging market central banks, are major buyers of gold. That's going to continue. Investors haven't even really participated yet, but they will, probably at much higher prices. Silver was really bound to take off. It was near 90 to 1 with gold, record lows. Gold was marching higher, really from 2000 to 2200. 2,300-ish. And silver hadn't even moved. Silver was still below 25. And then all of a sudden it spiked up to 30, pulled back a bit. But I think now silver is broken out and it's joined gold and will ultimately eclipse gold as far as the percentage gains, not the price. But I think, percentage-wise, I think that silver could hit $50 an ounce before gold hits 3,000. And so that's a much bigger gain for the price of silver than the price of gold. But again, I think the reason was the central banks. They weren't buying silver. They were just buying gold. They don't have room to store silver. And also, the central banks aren't investing in the mining stocks. So, it's the retail public and institutions that might have been investing, and they were not. Again, they don't understand it. They think that gold or silver should be going down because it's a soft landing. Everything is great. Buy the Magnificent Seven. And those who are worried, well, they were buying Bitcoin. I think that the launch of these Bitcoin ETFs really, provided that smokescreen, because when everybody should have been talking about gold's rally, they were talking about these Bitcoin ETFs, which were the most successful ETFs as far as how much money went into them. They're not going to be successful from the point of view of the people who were dumb enough to buy them. It's going to be a complete failure. But Wall Street did, sucker in a lot of speculators, so they're making money for now in these ETFs. But I was actually watching during that first month or so we're trading. Like, there was 1 week where gold went sideways and gold stocks were down like 15%. And it was like, well, what's going on? And I thought, well, maybe people are selling off their gold stocks to buy the Bitcoin ETFs, because the money had to come from somewhere. And in fact, all year, we've had record outflows out of GLD, which is the biggest gold ETF, at the same time where gold prices are running up to record highs. And normally it's the opposite. Normally the retailers are chasing a rally. They're not selling into the rally. And so what that tells me is that they've got it wrong. This rally has legs. It has a long way to go. It's not going to be until we have huge inflows from the retail public that we're probably going to get a significant correction. Probably not even a bear market at this stage, but we could have a 5 or 10% correction if the public jumps in. But so far, they're still selling. I think that these stocks are still incredibly cheap. Gold stocks have been the ironic victim of inflation. You would normally think, oh, high inflation, that's good for gold miners. The problem is the investors haven't really recognized how bad the inflation threat is, and they haven't bid up gold prices enough, but the cost of mining has gone up dramatically. Most gold companies are making less money today mining gold at 2,400 than they were mining it at 500 because of the increase in energy costs and labor costs. But what nobody seems to notice is that recently now, gold prices are outstripping the gains in a lot of other commodities. And the dollar has stayed firm, meaning the gold price in terms of other currencies has actually risen faster than it has in dollars. And most mining companies, their wages are in those other currencies. So the margins, I think, over the last few months have really improved rather remarkably in these gold stocks. And so I would be looking for that to be reflected in their earnings that come out. And maybe that'll be a catalyst or a wake-up call to Wall Street to buy these stocks. But before they get that wake-up call while they're still sleeping, I would advise your listeners to be moving heavily into this segment, recognizing it is a risky segment. So, don't put money in there that you absolutely can't afford to lose. But if you do have risk capital, this is what risk capital is for, because the upside potential, I think, dwarfs the downside risk. I think it's a unique opportunity to make, stellar returns. First of all, I definitely watch the whole energy sector. Oil is a very important commodity, not only in the production of goods, but in the transportation of goods. Copper is also an important commodity to watch. It's used in a lot of key things that we need. And too, you've got the big move towards electric everything, and that takes a lot of copper. People forget, okay, we're not going to use oil, all right, but where's it going to get the copper? Where are you going to get the nickel or some of these other minerals that need to be mined? But I'm looking at the agriculture complex. I mean, you've got certain key cocoa, coffee, things that have really exploded. But I'm looking for, bigger moves in the grains when you start to see the wheat and the corn and the soybeans, because these are the ingredients that are really going to put a lot of pressure on grocery prices, even more so than we have. And then you look at, other hogs and cattle and, the meat, because that's really going to bite, when it's the food that ends up costing. Americans take food for granted, right? Because it's been so cheap for us on a relative basis. But when it starts eating into a bigger percentage of your paycheck, it becomes a big problem. And, people initially respond by, reducing the quality of their meals. And that doesn't even make it sometimes into the CPI the way they hedonically adjust it. It's like, oh, okay, well, you used to eat filet mignon, and now you're eating, chopped meat. Well, you're still eating meat, so we'll say there's no inflation, right? Because you're just spending on hamburger what you used to spend on steak. Well, by that logic, if Americans have to eat dog food, they can say, well, that's fine because the dog food just costs what steak used to, and they're still eating, right? So it's like it misses the degradation in the standard of living and your quality of life. People just skip breakfast maybe, which isn't a bad thing. You don't need it. I do intermittent fasting myself, but I'm not doing it out of necessity. I'm doing it for health reasons. It's not that I can't afford to eat. There was this one executive I saw interviewed on television, and he was really excited because I think it was Kellogg's, their earnings were going up because he said, yeah, people are eating cereal for dinner now, right? Because that's all they can afford. So they could skip breakfast and then have their cereal at night instead of in the morning. It was like, in the 1970s, when the heating costs were going up, Jimmy Carter said, well, just wear sweaters, right? That's just going to be America, right? We can't afford heat, so we wear sweaters, right? We can't afford air conditioning, so I don't know, we just walk around in our bathing suits. But it's just, our standard of living as a nation is going down because the things we used to take for granted become too expensive to afford. And, you could thank governments. This is the government imposing this burden on the population in order to continue its reckless spending.